Hello, my name is Georgia, and when I was 6 years old, I ran away to the circus. It was less of a run and more of an elaborate carpool system orchestrated by my parents, but nevertheless, there I was, the circus. And for the next 10 years, I got to travel to fringe festivals and perform, watch shows, and get carpet burn on like 80% of my body. It was truly magical. So when I came to NIDA, I was quietly confident that I'd be able to bluff my way through some of the theatre talk. I had been watching Circus for over a decade, and surely there was some overlap. But as the weeks went on, it became clear that though there was value to my knowledge, Circus didn't quite cut the canon. It existed on the fringe. Now, this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon, or even a bad thing. Actually, historically, circuses have capitalized on being on the fringe. You see, from this vantage point, it was easier for them to sell their brand of freedom, a world free from the norms and rules that govern the human body and experience, or something to that effect. Today, I'm going to talk about how women's circus costumes at the turn of the 20th century helped to further sell this narrative of freedom. The stories that I touch upon are exciting and interesting. However, ultimately, some are quite tragic, and I will be touching upon the themes of suicide and domestic violence. And if that's just not something that you need to hear today, then I completely understand if you want to take a moment to yourself. I promise I won't be offended whatsoever. Historically, the circus would be considered low upper, both lowly performers, but also still on the fringe. This was in part due to the fact that circus was transient in nature, was never really in one community long enough to be considered a part of it. People would go to the circus when it came to town knowing that it was a visitor, not one of them. The circus was a reinforcement of the majority's sense of normalcy. Think of it as good for you, not for me. However, because circus existed on the fringe and outside of the functional sphere of society, it was a great platform to problematize and defy social norms and push boundaries. The circus provided an arena for public displays of the human body, especially for women, which at the time was largely restricted. Up until the late 1880s, women wore corseted costumes in the circus. A slightly reductive description of this would be that they wore basically the same undergarments that society women wore, just as outer garments. Though the scantily clad getup would have signified to the audience that they were free, the reality is they would have been just as restricted as their audience counterparts. Now, with the invention of the leotard by French male aerialist Jules Leotard in 1860s, we actually see a stripping of the corset. And for once, women were able to move their bodies in a way that would have been typically considered masculine. You know, like moving your torso freely. Using female bodies in acts of strength, courage, and bravery was considered progressive, but masculine, and needed to be veiled in femininity, with feminine traits, movements, and costume. The costume had to enable these courageous feats, all the while still signaling femininity through its cut, color, and adornments. Now that we understand gender as a performative construct, it's interesting that even back in this era, at the turn of the 20th century, female aerialists were undoing gender and reconfiguring it within the context of the circus. My initial hypothesis was that this would have enabled greater employment opportunities for women in the circus. However, the more I researched, it seemed as though women were just having to work so much harder in order to do the same tricks and perform this gender. Now, if it was hard for women, it bears mentioning that it was even harder for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the circus. On top of performing gender, BIPOC performers were often stripped of their unique cultural identity and asked to appropriate the adornments of other colonized cultures. Once again, using costumes to create a narrative of freedom and escapism. This is Vera Bruce and Alfredo Cardona. Now, through my research, I came across this image and something about it stayed with me. I think it's her intense stare, like she's just focused. And I don't know, I wasn't that interested in Alfredo, but something about Vera was interesting and I wanted to know more. So through a combing of the web, I found little bits of her story. She was born in 1905 to Australian parents who were both circus performers. She went to boarding school in Adelaide, and at the age of 16, she went and joined her mother and brother, who at the time were performing at the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, the biggest circus coalition of the era. It was here that she met Lillian Lietzel, the queen of the circus. They were kindred spirits, and Lillian took Vera under her wing. Now, if Lillian was the queen of the circus, then Alfredo Cardona was the king. He was the other main ring act at the time, though he was earning half of what Lillian made. And his act, the Flying Cardonas, consisted of his brother Lalo, his wife Clara, and himself performing the flying trapeze. But you see, Alfredo was in love with Lillian. And when Clara fell from the rig and injured herself, rendering herself incapable of touring with them, he actually divorced her and then married Lillian. So in need of a replacement for his flying trapeze act, Lillian suggested Vera. Now fast forward to 1928, and you have a group of these two women at the top of their game. However, Lillian and Alfredo's marriage is suffering. They had tried to, and failed to open their own circus with an oncoming Great Depression, and there were a lot of reports indicating that Alfredo was violent towards Lillian. During the winter season of that year, the two acts, Lillian Lietzel and the Flying Cardonas, were booked to go to separate venues. Lillian was off to Copenhagen, and the Flying Cardonas were off to Berlin to perform in the Winter Garden. Sadly, in the opening night of Lillian's performance, an element of her rigging broke, and she fell to her death. Understandably, this devastated Alfredo, and he became quite risky with his performances. On one occasion, he fell, permanently injuring himself, only compounding that depression. At this point, he decided he's going to marry Vera, because, you know, nothing solves trauma and depression like marriage. So, a year after Lillian's death, they tied the knot. But Alfredo still isn't happy. Go to therapy. But Vera, she's killing it. MGM wants them to sign on as stunt doubles for their upcoming films, and an independent filmmaker by the name of Jack Cummings wants to shoot a documentary about them. And it was here that I realized that my research had actually come a full circle. You see, that initial image that really stayed with me was in fact a still from Jack Cummings' documentary. And this image here, costume included, was completely replicated in the 1932 MGM movie Polly of the Circus, starring Marion Davies, Clark Marshall, and Clark Gable, and featuring the stunt work by none other than Alfredo Cardona. Taking inspiration from this, I decided that I too was going to make a replica of this costume, or at least something inspired by this great history, a moment of circus history. When it came to constructing the garment, I knew that I wanted to work within the parameters of what a 1930s dressmaker would have had themselves. You see, Lycra wasn't popularized until the 1950s, but what they did have was lastex, a process of spinning natural fibers around latex threads and then knitting it together. Now, what does this mean? Basically, Lycra can stretch both up and down the body and across, giving you full-ish movement, whereas knitted fabrics technically only go one way, which again basically just means more wedgies for the performer, and more pattern making for me. I ended up finding a really beautiful cotton, wool and elastane blend, and it looked as close as what I could have seen on the screen here, so I bought it. I dyed it a beautiful dusty pink as like a nod to that signifying of femininity, and adorned it with lace applique in the same areas as Vera's costume. The sleeves are an interesting addition. You see, none of the men of this era have sleeves, so it felt like another one of those signifiers of femininity. I chose to do a 1930s cap sleeve cut on the bias, but followed suit with what both of these costumes had, where it was only sewn down to the turning point and then let freely to flow down, giving the illusion of a fully set-in sleeve, but still allowing full movement. In order to bring this costume about, I watched this documentary over and over, just scouring the really few moments that Vera was actually on screen. While doing this, I always looked for that intense stare that she had, you know, the one from the photograph, but it must have been edited out or perhaps never captured on film. But it was interesting because, you see, just a couple of years later, Vera filed for divorce and agreed to meet Alfredo in the lawyer's office. She took her mum, though, because the night before, Alfredo brought a gun to the hotel room. So, as she met him in the lawyer's office, he asked the lawyer to leave the room. He pulled out his gun and shot Vera and then himself. She was 36. She deserved so much more. And it felt like the least I could do was tell her story, give her a moment all to herself. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. It was so much easier.